We'll talk primary winners and losers and Speaker Madigan's proposed millionaire tax next on CapitolView. Good evening, and thank you for tuning into this week's edition of CapitolView, the show where we talk about Illinois politics and government. I'm your host, Jamey Dunn with Illinois Issues Magazine, and with me today is Brian Mackey, State House reporter for WUIS and Illinois Public Radio. Brian, thanks for being here.
Happy to do it.
And Nicole Wilson with 24/7 News. Nicole, thanks for coming back.
No problem.
So it was a big week in politics, Illinois politics this week. It was primary week. We all watched this very closely. Didn't see a lot of turnout, but we saw a lot of interesting stories emerge in this week's primary. The race that, of course, everyone is paying attention to, or was paying attention to, was the Republican primary for governor. Brian, any surprises there? The polling didn't really track to what we saw on election night.
No, it certainly didn't. We had Bruce Rauner way out ahead in the polls, 44% to the next closest was State Senator Kirk Dillard, who had 27%. And ultimately, it was kind of a squeaker for Mr. Rauner. Rauner is, of course, a very wealthy businessman from Chicago, a private equity investor. He's a newcomer to politics. That's kind of his selling point, that I'm not a career politician. I can go in and shake things up. That's his favorite talking point. And he was projected to lead big. He spent a lot of his own money, more than $6 million, as well as millions of dollars of other people's money on the primary. He dominated television advertising and ultimately just won by 3 percentage points.
Yeah, watching the numbers come in, Nicole, I know I was like, oh, this is really getting exciting. It's kind of a squeaker. You were with the Rauner folks. What was happening there as they were seeing Dillard, tracking a lot more closely in the numbers than maybe were expected?
Some of the people there were getting a little nervous. They were because they were concerned about where those polling places were that hadn't yet reported. And you saw 11% lead in the beginning, and then it was cut down to about a 7%, and then all the way down to 2%. And I think at one point it was just a few thousand votes. And so the people over at Rauner's headquarters were starting to get a little worried, watching the TVs very closely, wondering if he would actually pull it out. Still very hopeful. And in the end, obviously he did. So they were very, very happy to see that he pulled it out. One interesting thing about Rauner's headquarters this year was that you saw more minorities in the crowd, and that is very not typical for a Republican primary, especially in a primary. You don't usually see a whole lot of minorities, Latino and African Americans in the crowd over there.
That is interesting. A lot of the core Republican gatherings when we see here in Illinois, they're pretty white, so that may be telling of what will happen heading forward for Rauner as far as building bases amongst some minority groups.
Particularly telling as it relates to crossover voting. A lot of the minorities there said, hey, this is my first time voting Republican. And when you ask them why, they're saying, hey, this is just, we need a change. Governor Quinn has had his time in office. He hasn't done much, and what he has done has failed in their terms. And so they're tired. They want someone to come in and shake things up in Springfield, and they're saying, hey, they think Bruce Rauner is their man.
I wonder how big that effect is going to be in the election, though. Of course, Mr. Rauner had a press conference on Thursday morning this week where he talked about Democrats and independents for Rauner, and former state senator, and the Reverend James Meeks, who is the pastor of a very large church in Chicago. He is apparently supporting Bruce Rauner, although he did not actually make it to the press conference. But he's going to be supporting Mr. Rauner. And you also saw Newton Minow, for example, who was the FCC chairman under John F. Kennedy. A lot of people, or I should say, a couple of dozen people who are Democrats say they're supporting Mr. Rauner. But the real big story of crossover voting in this primary were the Democrats who took Republican ballots. And there's a lot of thought that the unions did a pretty strong job, better than a lot of people had expected, getting their members and allies to vote for Kirk Dillard, and that's what made it so close for Bruce Rauner.
Which brings up the question is, are the unions kicking themselves in the butt for not stepping up sooner than they did? And I think they might be a little bit
Yeah, well, the unions aren't monolithic, right? So you have, there's two big teachers unions. There's AFSCME, which represents a lot of state employees. You have operating engineers, not to mention carpenters and plumbers and everything else.
SEIU healthcare professionals.
Exactly, so, which is a lot of home care workers, people you might not even think of as being unionized necessarily, but they've been added to unions in recent years. And but they don't operate as a monolith, and apparently there was a lot of internal debating about what direction to take. Do we go with Dan Rutherford? Obviously that would not have been such a good strategy since his campaign imploded amid allegations of misconduct, which he denies, of course. But you know, this sort of unions waiting, kind of they broke late in favor of Dillard, and you know, yeah, you're right. Maybe waiting so long cost them some support they could have ginned up earlier.
It almost seems like they needed to start, whoever they picked before they made that decision, just beating up on Rauner as much as they could before they decided who the alternate option would be, but they really didn't take to that.
And they did that a little bit, but again, it was pretty late. I mean, Bruce Rauner had been on television advertising since October or November of last year, months. And it wasn't until this winter, really, you know, just a month or two before the election, that we started to see some of this union effort advertising against him. And, you know, people watching a public television show about public affairs might not believe this, but the vast majority of voters in Illinois get their information from TV ads. That's why it's so important.
Well, and that kind of leads us into what sort of campaign we will see against Governor Pat Quinn and Bruce Rauner. Brian, tell us a little bit about Quinn's primary first, because that was interesting.
It certainly was. I mean, the governor basically pretended he didn't have a primary. He was opposed by a gentleman named Theo Hardeman, who is a former anti-violence activist from the Chicago area. He did not have a lot of money. He self-funded just a small amount for his campaign. Governor Quinn didn't debate him. He really didn't, like I said, he didn't do any advertising. He basically pretended he didn't have an opponent, and yet Theo Hardeman ended up winning 28% of the vote and even beat Quinn in what, 20?
30
yeah, okay, I didn't see the last count. Yeah, beat the governor in a number of counties. And what's really surprising, Theo Hardeman is an African American, yet in some of the far southern Illinois, some of these counties we don't necessarily associate with, you know, supporting an African American candidate usually in elections, ended up voting for him over Governor Quinn.
One of the things that I found interesting about that, you know, a lot of us are looking to that and saying, oh, Quinn's got trouble. And I don't want to downplay it because he likely does. But speaking yesterday to Professor Kent Redfield, friend of the show, who is often on the show, he pointed out, he looked back at the numbers that a lot of primaries for governors running for re-election, they did see a large protest vote with whomever was running against them. One example was Rod Blagojevich, and then went on to win. So it doesn't necessarily mean anything in the long run, but it should be.
And Blagojevich not only had Edwin Eisenrath running against him in the Democratic primary in 2006, but he also had a Green Party candidate that did so well that the Green Party became an established party in Illinois, that's a pretty high burden to overcome, and he still beat the Republican candidate. So this is not, I mean, it would be a more fun news story to be able to say Governor Quinn's in trouble, but you got to imagine that given how strongly opposed to Bruce Rauner the unions are, that they're eventually going to come home to Governor Quinn, even though they are not very, very big supporters of the governor based on what he's done with pensions and some other things.
And we're seeing already Bruce Rauner kind of tracking a little more towards being softer towards the unions, maybe a little more reaching out towards Democrats. He's kind of shaking the Etch-a-Sketch already, as Romney's campaign said. Maybe not shaking it clean, but he's making some changes early on, you know, with this reaching out to Democrats, independents, saying he is a friend to unions. Nicole, how do you think that, you know, is going for him? He's getting on it really quick.
He is. He has a history of changing his mind or changing his opinion on the views when it seems unpopular. So, you know, throughout the campaign, you know, he went to union bosses are evil, to I don't dislike union bosses, I just don't like the way they operate. And now, you know, since he's won the nomination, he has softened up even more. And so, you know, even yesterday, I believe he was in Chicago saying, hey, my granddad was a farmer and my uncle or somebody was a part of the union, and I flipped burgers. And so you see him trying to become more relatable and try to make himself as the average person. And I think unions aren't really hearing him. You know, AFSCME is saying, hey, we're going to do everything we can to keep him out of the office. He already owns 9 mansions. We don't want to give him the keys to a 10th. And so they are very, very adamant. They won't actually endorse Quinn at this point, but they are very adamant that they do not want Bruce Rauner in office.
It's really stunning. You were at his election night party, and he said something in his speech that really struck me. He talked about how I'm doing this for the working person, the carpenter, this, that, and the other thing. And one of the things he said is that teacher in Chicago who deserves our respect and deserves compensation or deserves to be rewarded or something along those lines. And I thought to myself, what happened to the evil government union bosses so quickly? And he has hardly said the word union since that victory speech, even during that victory speech. And so he really is trying to reset. One of the things that I have had a frustration with covering Bruce Rauner's campaign is that if it's not his talking point, if it's not his message that he wants to get across that very day, he will not answer questions. It's like pulling teeth. There was a Chicago Tribune editorial board, an amazing moment where they asked him again and again, what do you think about same-sex marriage? What do you think? He just would only say, I think it should go to the voters and they should decide. I won't say. And he does not have a lot of positions that you can go pin him back on. That allows him to be a little more chameleon-like. It's pretty good strategy from an electoral standpoint.
But the things that he does have a position on keep changing. So, you know, I want to lower the minimum wage. Oh, I don't want to lower the minimum wage. I want to keep it where it's at. And now I'm open to raising the minimum wage so long as we get business input. And so the things that he actually does have a position on keep changing. We never really know still where Bruce Rauner stands.
Which, as reporters, that drives us crazy. But for the Republican Party, they've definitely struggled with finding someone who can make it through the primary and then win that general election. I mean, can a Republican do that without backtracking from some of the things that they have to do to get elected in a Republican primary in the state?
Yeah, and that's the question, because usually you'd have social conservatives who would just eat a more moderate candidate alive. I mean, Bruce Rauner has said on tape, he's basically pro-choice. He didn't use those words, but he basically favors a women's right to choose. Exactly, right. And he is supported by Jack Roser, who is one of the most wealthy, pro-choice, socially conservative Republican. Thank you very much. One of the strongest pro-life. Jack Roser is pro-life. Don't sue me. Republican power brokers in this state. And I think Republicans have finally, swallowed their distaste at maybe some of these social issues for the idea of winning. I will say one thing about, we've been talking a lot about Bruce Rauner's refusal to take a position and changing positions. This is actually something, I was thinking about this today. I think he shares this with Governor Quinn a little bit, because you try to pin Governor Quinn down on what do you think should be in casino legislation? How do you want this pension overhaul to look?
What do you want to do about the tax increase sunset?
Just get me something on my desk.
Exactly.
And I'll sign it. Or I won't.
Bruce Rauner talks about bridging the divisions and bringing people together. I think he and the governor can come together on not taking positions on issues until they absolutely have to or want to, because it benefits them politically.
Well, and looking at the campaign, that lays before us, we're going to see a lot of spending. We may see the priciest gubernatorial campaign, that we've seen in Illinois. Where's the money going to come from?
Where's it not going to come from is the real question. I mean, you have the Democratic and Republican Governors Association, which are basically front groups for corporate interests and labor interests and moneyed people. You have Bruce Rauner's own vast wealth. He spent $6 million and seems willing to spend even more.
Like Hollywood on Quinn's side.
Absolutely.
You have the labor unions on Quinn's side, both statewide and nationally, who will probably pitch in to help Governor Quinn win this race. And so I think they're estimating this could cost up to about $80 to $100 million.
Yeah, and that's, you mentioned friend of the show, Kent Rootfield. He threw out that $100 million number. That would be by far the most expensive gubernatorial campaign in state history.
And I know it's early to be calling these kinds of things, but just broad strokes, what's this race going to be about?
I don't think it's that early. I think it's going to be about term limits, minimum wage, term limits, minimum wage, term limits, minimum wage. I mean, these guys have their talking points, and they're going to beat the heck out of each other with them.
Negative side, Nicole, what are we going to see drug out a little on both of these candidates?
Governor Quinn is already using the minimum wage issue against Bruce Rauner. He'll likely pull up the nursing home issue again. He'll probably start talking more about his pay to play and, the fact that he supports a Democratic governor and then gets $2.5 million worth of pension business. And so those types of things create conflicts of interest and really puts some type of reserve in Illinois voters' minds, because we've seen that type of thing. We've seen how those types of issues play out, and our voters are usually kind of skeptical of people who want to pay to play or pay to win anything. So.
And we're certainly going to see, I think, Governor Quinn pulling out the billionaire card. He
absolutely.
A number of times
and
in his...
Browner's given him no shortage of quotes for commercials.
I know.
For that.
And 0.01%. And
his campaign had this ad. I don't know if it's web only, so you're a little reluctant. But they put together, we'll say, a web video that compared Bruce Rauner to C. Montgomery Burns, who, of course, is the evil rich guy who runs the nuclear power plant in Springfield. Yes, excellent. And this ad explicitly compares the two of them, and it uses exactly like you said. I think it was a Sun-Times reporter who asked Bruce Rauner, "Are you in the 1%?" And he, in a moment of candor, said, "Oh, I'm probably in the 0.01%." And he made $53 million in income last year. He probably is in the in 2012, he probably is in the 0.01%.
And I think we'll see a lot of I can relate to the everyday person. You have Bruce Rauner talking about his $18 watch, or my grandfather was a farmer, and then today you've got Governor Quinn at the Gap, trying to show that he can shop where the average person shops. And I think he was shopping for his niece today in the Gap. And I think it really is comparable to the Romney-Obama campaign, where the Obama campaign was really attacking Romney on the fact that he couldn't relate to the working class people. And they had First Lady Michelle Obama in things like Gap and J. Crew. And, they had her saying, he is just like you. He leaves his socks on the floor. And so we could see some of the same issues in this campaign as we saw in that presidential election campaign.
And of course, these are both populists. They're going to have that populist message, and it's how you define the middle class, right? They both say that they're speaking on behalf of the average Illinoisan. It's just, how do you define it? Is that the small business owner, the person who maybe makes $100,000 a year and grumbles about their taxes and lives in a nicer area, has a good school district, and grumbles about having to pay high property taxes for it? Or is it that person who's struggling just to get by, paycheck to paycheck, maybe worried about their health insurance? It's who you define as your primary voters, and they're both going to say, I'm the populist, I represent the little guy.
And if it's the little guy who is struggling from paycheck to paycheck, then they're probably going to go vote for Governor Quinn, who wants to give them a $1.25 raise, right, which accounts only for about $70 a week, but it's something.
Yeah, but on the other hand, if it's the person who's a small business owner or a mid-level executive or something, they want the tax cut that Bruce Rauner is promising to give. So.
Absolutely.
Well, let's switch gears a little bit to legislative races. There were some interesting races that folks were watching that sort of encapsulated some larger political themes. What races were you guys, Nicole, let's start with you on the legislative side. What races were you kind of watching on the primary?
I think a couple that I was watching more closely than others were the Sandak and Sullivan races, the two Republican state representatives who voted yes for gay marriage and who had very, very heated races. I think Ron Sandak ended up winning by about 27 or 28 votes, which, if you ever wonder if your vote counts in that situation, absolutely your vote counts. Ed Sullivan ended up winning as well. I don't remember what the vote count was, but I think he had about 52% of the vote. Not a big, wide gap over his challenger either. And so I think that really was one of the most, I'm stuck.
More interesting.
Yes.
I think of the Republican Party. Very conservative candidates run with super PAC money to challenge these folks for. Yes. They said not necessarily for that vote, but it was clearly a factor.
It was a fact, I think. But you also have individual, like in the Sandak race, his opponent was being supported by another guy who's very active in Republican politics, who did generally very well, Dan Proft, with his candidates that he supported. That was the one that did not. But there's kind of a grudge there that goes way back to a mayor's race in the last decade. This is Illinois politics. It's all local. And people have long memories. In terms of other races that we were watching, I would say it was not a great night for the Democratic Party of Illinois. That's House Speaker Mike Madigan's organization. He had Tony Berrios, who was a young woman she's been in about 10 years since she was at one point one of the youngest legislators, and she had a challenge from a guy named Will Guzzardi, Ivy League educated, very progressive. It's kind of the progressive versus the machine. This is also an old story in Illinois.
Or last time around, it came very close.
Very close,
didn't
and
beat it,
basically never stopped campaigning and ended up winning very handily this time around. And Tony Berrios is the daughter of a gentleman who is very active in, I think he's the head of the Cook County
And he's the Cook County assessor.
Yeah,
Yes.
and
Very tied into
Speaker
Cook
Madigan's
County
law firm
politics.
deals with
Yeah.
property. It's all very tied together, and let's just say that it was a race that Madigan had an interest in winning and lost. He had a candidate right here in Springfield, Sue Scherer, who was a lot closer than people had expected. She had a challenge. She did end up winning, and of course the Speaker supported Representative Derek Smeath, and this is one of the ones that really had people kind of scratching their heads. Derek Smeath is, of course, facing federal charges, which he denies, but he faces federal charges of accepting a $7,000 bribe for allegedly agreeing to help a daycare get a state grant. He was kicked out of the House of Representatives, including by the Speaker's vote. He was thrown
For
out.
that, everyone did.
He managed to, to his electoral credit and maybe the discredit of the voters in his district, I don't know, but that's fine. People make all kinds of choices. Democracy, yes, democracy
Or it
plus.
could have just been the fact that it was fairly close to the election. when
Right.
he was-
Time
So,
to
but the
field a
point
new
is,
candidate,
he wins.
yeah.
He wins re-election, and this time the Speaker supports him. And we actually had there's an unrelated news conference the Speaker gave late in the week. We had a chance to ask him about that, and he said, "We support incumbents. That's what we do." I guess incumbents even charged with felonies, yes, they support incumbents. And Mr. Smeath, Representative Smeath, lost. So he was kicked out of the House once by his fellow House members, and now he was kicked out by the voters in his district.
And let's move on to that press conference that Speaker Madigan had. He's proposing a new tax. Brian, can you tell us a little bit about how it would work?
Yeah, you might call it a millionaire's amendment.
I did call it that.
Yeah, exactly. This is, the Speaker is proposing, so Illinois has a flat tax rate, just a little bit of basic knowledge. You have a 5% income tax right now, although that's scheduled to roll back at the end of this year. This would say if you make $1 million or more, anything at that $1 million or above threshold would be subject to an additional 3%. And the money would all be earmarked towards schools. It would be distributed per student. So the poorest school districts in Illinois, and say Robbins or some places in the south side of Chicago that are very impoverished, or places on the north side in Winnetka, where Bruce Rauner is from, would all get the same amount. They estimate it would raise about $500 per student. It could be used for school construction or property tax relief.
Nicole, what was the response to this? I know it hasn't been out there that long, but what are folks saying whenever the Speaker kind of issues a release and lets people know, I'm interested in doing this? There's always a lot. It's always splashy.
It's still very fresh. Not a whole lot of response yet. The millionaires haven't had a chance to respond yet. I'm sure they won't like the fact that they're paying more, but Speaker Madigan says, hey, these are the people who can afford to pay more to educate our students, and why should they have a problem if they can pay their fair share to give more money to education? Then let's do it.
And of course, the timing of this is interesting because Governor Quinn is going to present his budget next week. How might this all tie together, Brian?
Well, you have, like we said, the tax increase is set to roll back. That's going to leave at least, the forecast right now is for $1 billion, that's with a B, that they're going to have to cut or extend that tax increase to make up that money. And
this particular proposal, the millionaire's tax, is projected to bring in $1 billion.
$1 billion, totally coincidentally.
Convenient.
Although the Speaker says this is not, he would not give a baseline for education funding where he thinks it should be, and he didn't want to talk about the tax increase or other related issues, but he views this as additional, not replacement for current funding for education. Of course, how that all shakes out in negotiations. And we should add, this would require changing the Illinois Constitution. Not only would it have to get big votes in both the House and the Senate, but we, the voters, would have to vote on it at the November election before it could become law. And totally coincidental in terms of the timing you mentioned, that Bruce Rauner, the billionaire that Governor Quinn keeps talking about, which I'm not actually sure if he's a billionaire or a multimillionaire. That's a bit of a great
man.
wealthy.
It's usually the safe
The other
moniker.
night, a half a billionaire. We think he's
It's-
worth
yeah.
about $500 million.
Right. So I'm sure totally coincidental, though, that Speaker Madigan is filing this millionaires amendment to draw a contrast.
Which he denies.
He denies that, but somebody else had the good sense to ask him, Mr. Speaker, you're a lawyer. Are you a millionaire yourself? And he said, if it's a good year, yes, I am. So even he would some years be subject to paying this tax.
In the same way that Bruce Rauner is only proposing term limits for the purposes of good government, right?
Of course, absolutely. Just to, I mean, he's not going to use that to gin up conservative voters and get them out to the polls. It's just because that's the right thing to do for Illinois.
So looking ahead to Governor Quinn's budget proposal, we've got just a few minutes left. What should people be expecting? What should they be listening for when Governor Quinn puts his budget forth?
You know, one of the things I'm struck by, I mean, we should be listening for what the heck are we going to do about the tax increase? That is the billion-dollar question, right? What we used to call the $64,000 question. It's the billion-dollar question. And the other thing we're listening for is how relevant is this? The House and Senate budget committees, which generally don't start their work until after the governor's budget proposal, but because he had it pushed back so late this year, they've been doing their work. They've been taking testimony from agencies. They've been crunching numbers. They've set that spending target, and that target that's been set in recent years is the one that sticks through the end of the budgeting process. I'm wondering how relevant the governor's proposal is going to be.
Your thoughts, Nicole?
Exactly the same thing. How relevant will it be? And again, the billion-dollar question, to use Mackey's words, is absolutely the thing that everybody wants to know. Am I going to have to keep coming out of pocket at the higher tax rate, or am I going to get a little bit of relief? Of course, Madigan wants to roll back some of the tax rates for corporations. Am I also going to find some relief? And I think if you're looking at this from the everyday, average person's point of view, then that is the question that people really want the answer to.
And education funding has definitely been in the spotlight this session, and it looks like from some budget memos that have been floating around that may be where some of the big cuts are going to hit. Are we going to see Governor Quinn, and we don't know, but is it a possibility that he may do what he did the last time he was running and say, we need to have this tax rate or we are going to cut $1 billion from education? Can we expect something like that, or?
You know, I mean, I'm reluctant to predict what we can expect. I've been curious about why the governor would delay this until after the primary election. He, of course, and Democrats who voted in favor of delaying the budget speech say it has nothing to do with the timing of the primary. But I'm not sure what, sort of in terms of a strategic political standpoint, whether it, he can try and run on a tax increase again. That would certainly differentiate him from Bruce Rauner, because Bruce Rauner says we need to let the taxes roll back. Of course, in the same sentence, Bruce Rauner also criticizes Governor Quinn for cutting the social safety net and cutting education funding. So I don't know, it's a little inconsistent to complain about high taxes and also the cuts in spending, because you need tax money to pay for these other things that government does. So that's always been the tension in Illinois.
And I think it's a very touchy subject this year. We have been hearing that education will take another cut, but it's very touchy because of the fact that Bruce Rauner has been attacking Governor Quinn on cutting education budgets for year after year after year. And so Governor Quinn may not want to cut the education budget this year because Bruce Rauner will definitely use it against him in the campaign.
Well, and we're going to have to leave it at that. I would like to thank my guests, Brian Mackey and Nicole Wilson, and I'm your host, Jamey Dunn with Illinois Issues, and we'll see you next week on Capitol View.